Hi, everybody. Am I speaking into it? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion. The organizers asked me to speak about consensus and the role of education in renewing it or securing it. And so my talk today is called Consensus as Challenge and Comfort, Given and Good. But before we actually begin, I'd like to open with a quick confession, a problem, and a clarification. So here's the confession. I'm not a neutral observer on the issue of consensus. Actually, at a personal level, I'm obsessed with consensus. You'll often hear me slip into the first person plural when I talk, and I have a constitutional, almost Canadian dislike of disagreement or unpleasantness. So that's just me. That leads to the problem because I've been invited here to give a talk that's supposed to sort of stir up questions and discussion. And to do that, you often have to gin up a little bit of disagreement. Yesterday, Brian mentioned the American historian Richard Hofstadter. Hofstadter once wrote that if an idea is new or heterodox and it's worth anything at all, it's worth a forceful overstatement. And so, sort of in that spirit, I've taken what my wife has repeatedly assured me are my most unpopular and oddball opinions about education, and I've tried to cram as many of them as possible into this talk. And it may turn out that in the end, I'm right about every one of them, and that would be lovely. But if not, I'm hoping they can actually kind of stimulate some good exchange, and we might come to some points of agreement at the end. It's, of course, again, my hope personally. So finally, I'd like to clarify what consensus implies in this context. Ours may seem like a particularly divisive moment, but we should recognize that almost every aspect of education is political and thus contestable, and that any agreement about the purposes of education in the past is prone to exaggeration. Likewise, it's always fair to ask about the depth of commitment to democratic norms in the past and the often exclusionary terms under which Western societies have conceived of democracy. With those caveats in mind, I'd like to argue that there's nothing new or necessarily troubling about, for instance, a divisive school board meeting. And as educators, we don't need to call for quietism or harmony as such, which, if anything, would seem to suggest that dissenting voices were being stifled. Rather, amid disagreement, we should be seeking a deeper commitment to consensual political norms and structures. Put differently, we should worry less about consensus on any particular issue, which isn't possible or even desirable, and more about the ends that we're pursuing and the habits and practices that we're cultivating in the process. So, in what follows, I'm going to argue that doing so requires a renewed commitment to the publicness of public education and outlining what I think that entails. So you may all be familiar with John Dewey's famous phrase that democracy is not a mechanism in which citizens merely perform political duties, but instead that democracy is a personal way of life that signifies the possession and continual use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. I see Dewey's formulation as a challenge in that it imposes a stringent, almost spiritual ideal that no one is likely to realize fully. But Dewey's formulation also strikes me as comfortingly descriptive, a picture of an existing and given reality. Not only do Dewey's attitudes create a democratic way of life, they're in turn reinforced and discovered within it. At least to some degree, it seems that merely living in self conscious relations with others sows the seeds of democracy. This is similar to what the political theorist Michael Oakeshott calls civil associations, those organic communities which cohere not around any totalizing ideology or final goal, but around reciprocity and custom, the interaction and inescapability of neighborliness. I would also point out that while Dewey offers political duties as a formal and somewhat minimal baseline, implying that democracy is more than just voting, the word duty carries the same moral emphasis as Dewey's reference to personal character. The question for schools is how to actualize and integrate these tendencies, how to infuse political duties with personal commitment. I'll just pause and say I was looking for an image for this little point. And a few weeks ago, the state of Michigan held a statewide contest for middle schoolers to design a new I voted sticker for people after they cast their ballots. A young woman in Grosse Pointe won, and I think she really kind of nailed it. She kind of captured the spirit of the thing. Um, yeah, this is my political philosophy summed up in one picture. Anyway, so the question is how to infuse political duties with personal commitment. And a broader version of that question, which has animated almost all of my academic work, is how education can bridge the gap between public and private spheres. My answer comes in a slightly different register than Dewey's, as I'll be drawing from a variety of conservative, communitarian, and existentialist writers. Nevertheless, I see our two positions as very much aligned. So, for my talk, the key issue is the longstanding dichotomy between liberal values, including autonomy, conscience, dissent, and the protection of rights claims, what are often described as negative freedoms or freedom from the government, and on the other hand, the inculcation of Republican virtues, particularly participation, duty, the common good, and the exercise of collective power, what used to be called the freedom of the ancients, based on antecedents in Greece and Rome, and that is the freedom in being the government. Deweyians love to reject this sort of either or construction, and of course, I agree that there needs to be a balance between these two positions, which in the Canadian and American context should be mutually reinforcing. Elements of that balance include a deference to family privacy and opportunities for pluralistic education outside the public sphere, as well as robust protection of participatory rights to speak, vote, and stand for office. Unfortunately, at the moment, I think we're nowhere near that balance. Indeed, I would argue that while we currently suffer from superficial invocations of liberal rights, most of our educational problems have come from a near abandonment of Republican duties by actors across the political spectrum. For the last 50 years, liberalism has been associated with strict neutrality on questions of the good, which are relegated to the private sphere, and in public with a focus on procedural rights claims, articulated and secured by bureaucratic agencies and the courts. Whether necessarily or not, modern liberalism has tended to rely on a rhetoric of inexorable social progress and an acceptance, even an encouragement, of public passivity, except in outbreaks of protest by particular interest groups. I think that we need to revive a robustly Republican approach to both civic education and school governance, which can, in turn, bolster consensus around liberal norms by prioritizing our meetings on shared ground as citizens, and at least frame a discussion around shared moral norms. To give a quick example of how republicanism might shift our understanding of contemporary education, sorry, I'll skip Calvin and Hobbes, although I love them. We'll come back to it. To give a quick example of how republicanism might shift our understanding of contemporary education, consider the free speech debates. The free speech debates currently roiling many universities. In Free Speech and its Relation to Self-Government, the philosopher Alexander Meiklejohn challenges us to approach this issue from the perspective of the good man or the virtuous citizen, who, for Meiklejohn, if political debate is nothing but an exercise of self-preference and force, oriented toward no ends outside ourselves, we've lost sight of its purpose. One cannot appreciate the freedom of speech, he writes, unless one sees it as an act of collective deliberation, carried out by, quote, a man who in his political activities is not merely fighting for what he can get, but is eagerly and generously serving the common welfare. Free speech is not only about discovering truth, or encouraging ethical individualism, or protecting minority opinions, which are liberals' usual lines of defense. It's ultimately about binding our fate to others by sharing the truth with our fellow citizens. This was a major theme of Maya's talk yesterday. Meiklejohn opposes the common recourse to a marketplace of ideas because it relieves citizens of exactly this duty. He writes, quote, as separate thinkers, we have no obligation to test our thinking, to make sure that it's worthy of a citizen who is one of the rulers of the nation. That testing is to be done, we believe, not by us, but by the competition of the market. Each one of us, therefore, feels free to think as he pleases, to believe whatever will serve his own private interests. We think not as members of the body politic, but as farmers, as trade union workers, as employers, as investors. Our aim is to make a case, to win a fight, to make a plea plausible, to keep the pressure on. It is, back to my words, an adversarial rather than deliberative model of democracy, which undermines the intelligibility and mutual respect that form the very basis of citizenship. Conversely, a robust commitment to that very form of respect can ensure what the philosopher Sigal Ben Poreth calls dignitary safety, the assurance that all participants in an exchange are valued as equal contributors to a shared endeavor, which, in the context of politics and education, is, in her words, not merely persuasive in nature, but also expressive, relational, and sometimes communal. To my mind, consensus is inseparable from this kind of relational, communal engagement. At least within public institutions like schools, we need to articulate civic participation, equality, and democratic freedoms both as given under the terms of citizenship and as normative moral goods. One place this sort of moral engagement has persisted is in extracurricular activities, which incorporate elements of voluntarism and personal sacrifice on the part of students and their families. Indeed, in their pursuit of established standards of excellence, sports, music, and theater inculcate both the internal goods and the virtues that Alistair MacIntyre associates with practices, undertakings that he hopes will overcome the narcissistic individualism and divided selves of modern liberal societies. In each of these respects, extracurriculars are more similar to the associational, semi private spaces of civil society than to the increasingly bureaucratic classrooms and governments that structure modern schooling. They're also more likely to be led and evaluated by community members, in addition to professional educators, and to foster community spirit. It's hardly coincidental that extracurriculars expanded just as secondary education became universal, or that parents and students saw them as legitimate means of character formation, just as moral instruction declined in the classroom. During the school day, it's a different story. One of the tenets of liberal neutrality has been what John Rawls describes as public reason, which in its simplest form prohibits any divisive metaphysical or religious claims as justifications for political action. And, that's fine with me. However, against Rawls's own intentions, one frequently finds this principle defined down to the point that it undermines any basis whatsoever for moral agreement or disagreement and precludes any real claims to justice. Whereas political theorists like Amy Gutman argue that a liberal state must enable children to deliberate among competing conceptions of the good life and the good society, it's not clear to me that schools offer sufficient moral resources to think about the good in any terms at all. If the experience of my two children is at all representative, then classroom rights and responsibilities have mostly become entirely extrinsic, either coercively imposed or reduced to naked self-interest and outright bribery. All my 7-year-old talks about these days are reward points and prizes. Meanwhile, the ends of education in the public sphere are defined in the ostensibly neutral language of science, medicine, and economics. I should be clear that I'm not opposed to science, health, or wealth as such, but none of these categories is an appropriate basis for moral judgment, and none of them should relieve individuals of the responsibilities of self-government. Indeed, as the philosopher Jennifer Frey puts it, the misguided attempt to objectify political discourse is a symptom of fear and evasion, an investment in our own trivialization. We've adopted a very small view of ourselves and others, she writes, as consumers and patients and members of interest groups, accepting diminished and easily manipulable conceptions of human capacity, reductive caricatures that the essayist Marilyn Robinson sees as the work of a grim and minor imagination. I was struck by this tendency a few years ago when I taught a summer enrichment course for a group of gifted high school students, and I mean like gifted high school students. We read philosophy together, and they would write short response papers for me. I soon discovered that all of these responses followed a very strange pattern. While the students would open with uncompromising moral positions of the type that one hears shouted on many campus quads, the paragraphs that followed would substantiate them with little data points, a statistic maybe, or a social scientific finding. In short, they were trying to use objective authority to obscure the fact that they were making moral claims at all. Why? It took me about a week to figure out that they were simply doing what they had been taught by the Common Core curricular standards. These are the same standards that classify any value-based claim as an opinion rather than a fact, and that focus on skills to the exclusion of beliefs, or indeed any particular content, which might, after all, require debate and compromise, the identification of moral exemplars, or the establishment of a literary or civic canon. In a similar vein, the philosopher Brian Warnick and I recently wrote a book about school punishment, which included the phrase moral community in its subtitle. Exhibit A. Now, no one's ever challenged our use of that phrase. Maybe they assume it was just a euphemism, but I think we meant it. Without downplaying the importance of legal constraints, after all, public schools do remain an arm of the government, I don't think that schools or classrooms can be as arms of government. They inevitably communicate moral messages to students and can and should play a role in children's moral formation. Brian and I argue that moral education and classroom citizenship demand a new approach to punishment, in which students and teachers can make moral and not simply legal or procedural claims on each other. This argument does not align neatly with prevailing political positions. For instance, although we defend restorative justice approaches, which take seriously claims of wrongdoing, responsibility, and community, we're critical of some of the therapeutic tenets of social emotional learning, or SEL, which tend to focus on psychological adjustment and bodily regulation at the individual level. Again, framing interventions in terms of health and objective science. I've found that this distinction confuses people, however, since both the left and the right seem to treat restorative justice and SEL as a package deal, as signals or slogans rather than individual policies worthy of critical reflection. And now, speaking of policies, I'd like to pivot to adults and issues of school governance. To suggest a renewed political consensus implies that there's some historical antecedent to which we should return. My ideal, and in some ways Dewey's, is the one-room schoolhouse. I don't offer these schools as a nostalgic symbol of harmony or simpler times. In fact, my last book features hundreds of cases in which they burned down after local disputes. But I offer them rather as a crucible of participation, in which voters were responsible for funding, staffing, and administering education for their own children and those of their neighbors. A common touchstone for this kind of thinking is Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. Tocqueville was in some ways critical of democracy, which he worried, quote, disposes each member of the community to sever himself from the mass of his fellow creatures and to draw apart with his family and friends, so that he willingly leaves society at large to itself. However, Tocqueville found a countervailing tendency at work in voluntary associations and local institutions like schools, which could draw people back into public affairs. In the words of the political theorist Bonnie Honig, local schoolhouses were public things, prods to action that allowed diverse peoples to experience themselves as a collected, if not a collective, public. In Tocqueville's terminology, they were the essence of civil society, which pointedly straddled the line between private and public institutions, cultivating mores that imbued the public good with personal meaning. There are both moral and epistemic benefits to local school governance. The author Wendell Berry has emphasized that local life is intimately dependent for its quality, but also for its continuance upon local knowledge, accumulated through intergenerational experience and practical judgment. Berry contrasts local knowledge with what he calls ready-made thoughts, which, untethered from place and practice, produce a society in which fewer and fewer people will possess independently the power or ability to make up their own minds. Dominance of mind, he writes, always implies, politically and economically, dominance by somebody else's mind, or worse, by the mind of a government or corporation. Today, one need not look far to see people falling prey to slogans, polarization, and largely symbolic politics because they have no way to make up their own minds and very little to make up their minds about. Like Tocqueville, Berry frames freedom as a public exercise, not as selective rights claimed by individuals, but as a rejection of domination and an assertion of civic competency and independent thinking. As the rural education scholar Faith Dunn puts it, self-government is almost always better than so-called good government. Berry also argues that we've become alienated from our means of living. It's through work that we become stewards of the earth, he writes, sharing a commitment with others to life's preservation. Unfortunately, he continues, ours has become a world in which millions of people have lost any idea of the materials, the disciplines, the restraints, and the work necessary to support human life. With this line, Berry not only echoes Dewey, but touches on three concepts central to Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. For Arendt, labor describes undertakings that sustain the body. Tied to cyclical natural processes of life and death, labor is ephemeral. A second category, work, involves the production of durable artifacts, and through them, the continuation of meaning, culture, and history between generations, the foundations of a world that we all inhabit, inherit, and share. For Arendt, the world is given in that it pre-exists any individual, but as a human creation, it's also fragile. The preservation of a shared world is a choice, and it's only possible through her third category, action, which puts forward collective deliberation as the endpoint of human freedom. Arendt's action draws from classical notions of the good life, in which humanity's reason and innate sociability make politics the highest calling, politics in this sense being a joint enterprise among equals and a vehicle for justice and the moral or spiritual improvement of society. Arendt extends these ideas into the language of modern existentialism, in which reality is brought into existence through the radical freedom of individuals and the inevitability of existential choices. In both cases, action is a source of responsibility. As Kierkegaard puts it, our souls are matured in the hour of decision, as when we speak, judge, and vote. Arendt's fear is that without a public sphere in which to participate, confined to labor and work but denied action, we've reduced ourselves to what she calls the social, but the ancient Greeks might have called idiocy, a pejorative sort of privacy that Arendt equates with selfishness, divisiveness, thoughtlessness, and susceptibility to peer pressure. Idiocy is evident in many forms of privatization in school governance and rhetoric, as well as in the relentless neoliberal focus on job skills and individual advancement as the ends of education. It's also evident in the adversarial models of democracy that many people now seem to take for granted. Activism and protest are sometimes necessary, but they're not, in fact, the sign of a healthy republic. If anything, they're a symptom of unacceptable disempowerment, reactive rather than proactive participation, and too often gratuitous assertions of self-interest. Action is surely called for, but as a collective citizenry confronted with nuance and responsibility, rather than as energized factions dealing in the self-contained certainty of competing ideologies. Finally, idiocy is evident in the over-reliance on litigation, external authority, and bureaucracy, which Arendt, channeling Heidegger, describes as rule by nobody, in that bureaucrats are neither answerable nor honorable as individuals. Indeed, for all the valid concern about disinformation, we can't defer to any institutional source of information as a political authority in itself. Climate science, for instance, can inform, but should never dictate climate policy. We should eschew any demand to follow the science, trust teachers, or leave it to the market if that demand implicitly usurps our own judgment. To Brian's remarks yesterday, I think that thoughtful citizens will seek out expert guidance. I mean, that's obviously the wise thing to do, but they shouldn't cede their authority to a technocracy or epistocracy, a rule of experts or insiders. If problems like polarization and bullshit result from irony, cynicism, and irresponsibility, it seems to me that responsibility and consequences, in like a real sense, are kind of an obvious antidote. For me, the collapse of judgment is clearest in what have recently been called book ban or censorship campaigns. From a liberal perspective, these efforts are obviously undesirable because they impede the free exchange of ideas and the expression of unpopular or minority viewpoints, limiting children's exposure and perhaps teaching them habits of intolerance. From a Republican perspective, however, the liberal complaints miss an important point. While the adoption or removal of any particular book may be unwise, the fact is that adults bear responsibility to educate children by choosing the materials that they deem valuable. For Arendt, this is the world that we choose to preserve. There exists no universal right to read in public schools, despite recent slogans, and invocations of such a right on behalf of children are in fact either abdications of adult responsibility and authority, or a disingenuous shift of that authority from elected representatives to teachers, librarians, or publishers. Books are obviously not banned when they remain available on the private market. And while the private sphere should permit adults to deliberate on any and all viewpoints, the same need not hold true for school children. I might mention that in my own school district, lots of the parents who got involved as opponents of book removals were shocked to discover that they too disapproved of some of the challenged books. On the other hand, there were recently 2 conservative crusaders that got elected to our Board of Education, and 3 more now standing for election, who are slowly discovering that responsible leadership cannot be reduced to reactionary slogans. Go figure. All of this is to say that while one might robustly advocate a liberal approach to book selection, one should never do so at the cost of deliberation itself, nor with the condescension toward local voters that marks the real threat to democratic consensus. Finally, and somewhat deflatingly, I should acknowledge that the kind of Republican citizenship I'm advocating requires a legitimate delegation of responsibility to lower levels of government. School administration is one of the few sites where that sort of power still exists, but it's hard to miss the century of reforms that have pushed centralization at the state, provincial, and national levels, and more recently, radical decentralization through private alternatives like vouchers. I doubt that my remarks today are going to stem those tides, although to my mind, any hope of consensus depends on doing so. My only comfort, again, is that this sort of democratic engagement is good and fundamentally given. It's certainly part of the world that we've inherited. And while one might ask, who am I to do anything about it? That's in fact the wrong question. On Arendt's account, action is a revelation, indeed a creation of the self, both in the singular and the plural. Insofar as consensus depends on a common ground of action, and insofar as one achieves democracy by doing it, the questions we should be asking each other are, who are you? Who are we? And what ought to be done? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Cam. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dan Sear, who will be responding to Cam's talk. And Dan sorry, is a colleague that I've crossed paths with several times over the years at McGill, and I'm really happy that he was able to join us. He's the associate professor of religion, law, and public policy in the Faculty of Religious Studies here at McGill, and director of the Institute for the Study of Marriage, Law, and Culture, and founding director of the Newman Study Institute of Catholic Studies.
Despite the fascinating nature of the presentations yesterday, I was beginning to wonder about the relevance of my own religious studies background to these discussions, because the question of the relationship of religion to polarization seemed to be off the table. However, by the end of the day, when the hot topic of sexuality was brought into discussion, the dark specter of religion suddenly appeared. And so I'll briefly return to that naughty problem at the end of my comments. Professor Scribner invites us to think deeper about the role of educational institutions in modern democratic societies. And there appear to be three key elements that stood out for me as having critical significance in his discussion: the importance about deliberation on common goods and values within schools, the significance of local context, and retrieving a Republican approach to democratic deliberation. And I would just like to sort of spice these conversations with a bit more religion, a little bit of poetry, and some sex. First, Professor Scribner points out that our cultures have been shaped by a liberalism that has been associated with strict neutrality on questions of the good and relegates these concerns to the private sphere, affirming the right of each individual to envisage and pursue their conception of the good is a positive feature of liberalism. However, it can be formulated in ways that actually marginalize its significance, shut the door to meaningful dialogue regarding our diverse conceptions of the good and their possible implications for our common life. This creates a culture that works to stifle serious dialogue about our strong evaluations and commitments, and flattens and forms citizens who, in Charles Taylor's words, lose, quote, the ability to feel or think deeply about anything. Or in similar terms, T.S. Eliot lamented the final triumph of the hollow men who know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Taylor's work underscores the importance of strong evaluations and longings as a fundamental feature of human life. These are not just about personal preferences, but articulating deep evaluations about the quality of life, the kind of beings we are or want to be, what are our loves, our aspirations, the things that inspire and move us. I would add that most religious discourses also encourage reflection on the flip side of the coin, which is namely the harms, the evils, the dangers that need to be addressed in the human condition and in public policy. This is the domain of criminal law, civil law, and in a culture now that we see the stoking of fear and scapegoating have become common practices in various forms of populism. Do we foster good pedagogical practices for forming citizens capable of deliberating meaningfully when dealing with these darker dimensions of human life, as well as the brighter dimensions? Taylor also highlights a number of unique features to our discourse on the good in modern condition, pointing out we live in a context with a plurality of goods and longings that individuals and communities aspire to. This means that our democratic deliberations may have to envisage the possibility of the pursuit of diverse communal and common goods rather than a singular good. Furthermore, the search for the articulation of these goods tends to be far more tentative, probing, and incomplete than what was evident in older cultures, older metaphysical, dogmatic languages that sought to specify what the good is seen now too hard, too narrow for our contemporary context. So educators may want precise analytical forms of discussion and expression, but for some of our deeper aspirations, kind of these theory-laden discourses seem to be inadequate. And this sort of proposes unique but not insurmountable challenges for communication. Taylor says we need to turn to subtler languages to begin to articulate our visions of the good, languages that embody a certain humility and searching. Personal narrative stories are one way in which these aspirations are communicated. Taylor's most recent book, just published, Cosmic Connections, provides a lengthy exploration of the distinctive role of art and poetry in modern culture in articulating such visions of the good, as well as addressing the malaises and dangers that confront us. And there was a recent essay by Nicholas Tampio, Poetry and Democratic Education, that explores the value of poetic discourse in civic education. Arguably, religion remains a major site for the articulation of aspirations and identities in our cultures, even though it's a major target of the exclusionary disciplines of liberalism, relegating it firmly to the private sphere. Religion is no longer monolithic, but represents an array of diverse faith positions that also share the stage with a variety of non-religious worldviews that have their own strong evaluations. Can educational institutions be places where we learn to effectively articulate and explore core values and aspirations to foster mutual understanding and community between diverse religious and non-religious sectors? That's the specific objective that was enshrined in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, within our educational institutions, we've struggled to find paths for constructive engagement with faith-based aspirations. There was after the deconfessionalization of public schools in 2000, Quebec government did institute the ERC program. Despite its limitations and lack of resources, it did attempt to foster some religious literacy. Its approach to religion as culture did tend to discourage any meaningful discourse of core aspirations of religious faith. But with the decision to abolish the program, we're now moving towards back towards complete closure of discourse on this. The second theme about the importance of local context and the contribution of schools to cultivating democratic participation. Just one footnote to this discussion. Robert Wuthnow has noted that the local has become increasingly subject to processes of globalization. He coined the term local to characterize this kind of porous quality of the local in relationship to forces of globalization. Local communities and identities no longer operate in ways shaped by local civic institutions and associations. However, churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues still remain the sites for the largest gatherings of peoples each week within an institutional setting. In some ways, religion is still a major extracurricular activity. 40 years ago, one of the earliest essays articulating the theory of globalization in the social sciences argued that the transnational processes are leading to a fragmentation of identities. Traditional social bonds and communal identities are weakening. In the face of these developments, Robertson argued that religions are uniquely positioned to provide portable transnational sites of identities for individuals searching for meaning in an unpredictable world. He concluded with a prediction: globalization enhances religion and religiosity, and warns that societal civil religion concerns will be sites of potential religious, ideological, and conflict moving forward. Religious identities and commitments have come to play an increasingly salient role in our political communities. Various forms of religious nationalism, Hindu, Islamic, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, reshape our geopolitical landscapes. Religious diversity and identities feed into their political affiliations, our polarizations, even our voting preferences. And I could go on at length about that. Greater religious literacy might facilitate a more informed and constructive dialogue with these developments. Third, religion role in relationship to civic republicanism. Well, there's a slice of civic republicanism, large Italian, French traditions that tend to take a critical stance towards religion, since it's perceived to weaken one's attachment to political community. However, in Anglo-American traditions, we see a richer confluence of civic republicanism and faith. Historians like Mark Knoll have explored the convergence of American evangelicalism and civic republicanism, and echo de Tocqueville's description of American democracy as, quote, the result of two distinct elements, which in other places have been in frequent hostility, but which in America have been admirably incorporated and combined with one another. I allude to the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty. Now, the religious landscape has certainly evolved since de Tocqueville wrote. American culture is no longer defined by the dominant Protestantism of the 19th century, but by a broader religious pluralism that includes segments of the non-religiously affiliated folk, growing segments. But religions remain an important player in this landscape, and this poses a question that was alluded to in the recommendations of the Taylor-Bouchard Commission dealing with these issues. Are there ways to draw voices from local and transnational faith-based associations and communities into the process of fostering democratic deliberation and participation? And if so, how could this be accomplished? Finally, back to sex. Should sexuality be part of our deliberations on the good? And this may take us beyond just traditional approaches to sex education. Sexuality has been at the center of our evolving cultural wars for generations, as there's no indication that we'll be moving it back to the back burner anytime in the near future. Michel Foucault's landmark study on the history of sexuality explores the radical transformations of sexuality that have taken place in the modern era. Sexuality shifted from a category that largely dealing with specific acts that were prohibited or allowed to a dimension that is increasingly viewed as at the core of human identity. Modern culture is distinctive, therefore, he argues, in the ways in which it ascribes a depth of meaning and significance to sexuality and its capacity to shape personal identity and human fulfillment. Modern liberalism begins by insisting on the need for the state to keep out of the sanctuaries of our nation. By the 1960s, is also insisting on the need to, quote, keep the state out of the bedrooms of the nation. These domains are too charged, too intimate, too sacred, to use the language of the U.S. Supreme Court, for the state to manage, but requires protection by the state and the courts. Sexuality has moved alongside of religion, or in some cases displaced religion as something core to our identity. So I would argue we definitely do need sexuality to include sexuality in a discourse on the good. In sexuality, as in religion, there are deep divides in terms of our visions of human fulfillment. And I suspect that the way forward involves some of the elements that other speakers have addressed. First, fostering a culture of epistemics, trust in dealing with these diverse visions, not approaching alternative visions with an agonistic stance, a hermeneutics of suspicion, but a willingness to learn. Second, cultivating a healthy dose of intellectual humility. We're living through profound shifts and transformations in these intimate domains of human life. All our perspectives and visions are bound to be limited and incomplete. Even those settled into a path are still searching for enriched ways of understanding and experiencing their journeys. Third, our pedagogies need to be open to a dialogue on the deeper meanings and aspirations associated with sexuality. Is there a deeper reality, a depth that we are struggling to discover? Are there aspirations and experience of happiness, an expectation of fulfillment that beckons? Professor Burkholder touched on this when she put forward the theme of queer joy. What are the experiences and visions of happiness, fulfillment that shape our journeys into this mysterious and sometimes treacherous domain? Can these longings and aspirations be articulated and addressed in our educational settings, and can we find languages to share them? And how can the subtler languages of narrative and poetry help us in articulating these aspirations? Perhaps the time, I think, has come to rediscover the language of poetry. By the way, like one of the centerpieces in religious cultures like Judaism and Christianity is really at the midpoint, right at the midpoint of the Bible is something called the Song of Songs, which is an elusive and intriguing a series of erotic love poems. And ancient or both Jewish and Christian tradition has referred to this text as the Holy of Holies in terms of the faith tradition, and it's poetry. Perhaps the time has come to rediscover the language of poetry rather than polemics as we begin to articulate those loves and longings that arouse, inspire, and move us in this this personal, politically, and religiously charged domain of our lives. Thanks.
Okay, folks, questions? Oh. So Cam, I have a pair of related questions which pertain to the privilege, what I see as the privileging of the local. And they rely on an understanding of your position, which may not be accurate. So I'm going to outline that assumption to begin with, which is that it seems that your overall analysis of the politic depends on the sense that the most virtuous domain of civic and political process, the local, is dissolved, has been dissolved, or is at risk of being dissolved into market-based individualism and larger scale, more distant state control. So on attack from both ends. So my first question is, to me, local here seems to stand in for community. And I know that that's not the end of it, but I'm sort of looking for what local is and why it's virtuous. And so my first question is, why privilege geography as the prime locus of community? And the second question is, what vision of the moral life, the good life, does not require us to act on wrong elsewhere? So if we privilege the local as the prime locus of community in which we pursue our civic ends and strive for consensus, are we not also obliged by whatever version of the good life that we embrace to respond to wrong in other locals?
I'm going to knock this one out of the park, I hope. Yeah, I mean, I do privilege the local not merely as an accident of geography, but again, if we want to take a Deweyan perspective, as sort of the most immediate form of connection between human beings. And to Dan's point, it's never been true that the local is wholly local. People have always moved. People have always been connected to market economies. We've had globalization for a long, long time, millennia. And so by those lights, you're exactly right. I mean, it's not that we can only turn our attention to local needs or local goods or local wrongs. However, we also do have horizons for what sort of is immediately actionable to us. I mean, yes, there are starving children around the world right now, and here we sit. That's not to say that we're all immoral or callous people. It is to say that there are things that are closer to home that we have more direct control over, that we have more ability to sort of act on than others. They don't need to be mutually exclusive, obviously. But also when you're saying that there's a virtue to localism, or it's the most virtuous sort of place, you'll notice that I didn't, again, I'm not trying to wax nostalgic. I'm not saying that local commissioners or local school board members are just peachy keen. I mean, there's plenty of corruption. There are jerks everywhere. I mean, that's not a surprise to anybody. What I am suggesting, though, is that if action and participation actually is the content and the means of citizenship, that can only happen for most of us locally. Most of us are not members of parliament. Most of us are not, high-level politicians. And so it seems like, again, as far as personal meaning goes and personal morals go, it has to play out locally, both in the geographic sense, but also through other means of direct connection. It doesn't need to literally be your next door neighbor, although it should be that as well. But I do think that that does privilege institutions where one can have a voice and one can have a meaningful exercise of power.
Thought a lot if I should ask this question, but I think I should address the elephant in the room, which is the student campaigns that are taking place all over the world. And the students' encampments being shut down, isn't that like the biggest threat for democratic participation as you defined it? Not addressing it at all in the context of this conference for 2 days, talking about misinformation and disinformation is really very disheartening for me, and is kind of a way of showing me that we have a long way to freedom of speech. But yeah, just to come down to my question, shutting down student encampments and democratic participation in a way, how would you see that?
It depends, and a lot on one's own sort of political orientation and views. As I pointed out, someone like Arendt thinks that free speech is vital for adults. I mean, cannot be infringed. For kids, though, she takes a more what some people might call paternalistic view. I mean, they are not yet full citizens. They are citizens in the making. And so the idea that they enjoy all the rights and responsibilities of adults actually subjects them to peer pressure and other things. And so if we were going to talk about elementary school students or even high school students maybe engaging in encampments or protest, we would need to be careful, I guess, with how much autonomy or how much sort of self-governance we would ascribe them. Once you start talking about university students, of course, it gets even, I mean, it's always less touchy, I guess, because they're clearly citizens, they're clearly adults. I would say, though, that the venue, right, it matters. So I referenced Alistair McIntyre in my talk, and McIntyre is much more pessimistic than I am, but one of his big complaints is that modern multicultural societies don't share an ethical framework. And because of that, he says there's no way for them to have rational arguments about anything. So if you think about debates about abortion or debates about the current strife in the Middle East, all we're left with is which side can shout louder at the other side. But there's no real means of convincing them because they're not starting from a shared tradition or sort of a shared vocabulary where they could actually meaningfully say, you're right, we agree. Like, there's no way to actually have an exchange. And so, again, I'm not trying to say that I favor shutting down encampments or stifling I mean, no. I do worry that if encampments are merely meant to be a display of a certain kind of force, but not actually persuasion, and if they fail to persuade, if they can't actually make moral claims, that strikes me as really problematic. I said if at the beginning of that, and I wanted to underscore the if because I think obviously much of the current rhetoric around debates in the Middle East are obviously moral claims, and I think they should. Of course, all of us should have a certain kind of conviction on the inside and say, well, where do I stand? What should we be doing? Either we individually, we as a university, or we as a nation. So that's a kind of a long-winded and probably somewhat evasive answer. But I think for me, the key question is whether there's actually a ground to talk and listen. And I think in some ways, things like encampments are exactly that ground, but in some ways they might not actually be that ground if it's merely, again, a sort of demonstration of numbers or volume and not of reasons.
Could you clarify the relationship between
The green light.
Check.
We're in business.
Okay, now I got two. All right. So, Cam, could you clarify the relationship between book bans and civic republicanism? It seems like what your argument is that book bans are adults ignoring their own responsibility that they have over their authority to educate their children. And so, in book bans then are kind of a red herring. It's like we have the adults of our children have the authority to educate, and we're kind of outsourcing that through book bans.
Think, my response to a lot of the current discourse around book bans is that it is a red herring, and it's actually, I think, very unhelpful. Partly because, again, I should underscore, I'm against them. Like, I think we should take a very liberal stance to what kids have an opportunity to read in school within age appropriate bounds and whatever. But it seems like a lot of the rhetoric on the left that I've heard, both among academics and just regular people, is to say that these are book bans rather than some form of actual judgment on the part of, let's say, school boards, which inevitably they must be. School libraries do not stock every book. They don't stock Mein Kampf or hardcore pornography or any number of other things. Someone needs to judge what is in and what is out. And again, we would prefer those judgments weren't nakedly political. We would prefer they were, I think, liberal and sort of affirming. I think it's the responsibility of voters to elect people that make those good decisions and to weigh in. And I would also point out that the problem with a lot of our current, and honestly, it goes back at least to the 1920s, sort of culture war froth, is that it's true that inevitably, usually it's some kind of right wingers will take over the school board. Oh my God, they're teaching sex, they're, whatever it is. What people don't usually realize is that usually within about 6 months or one election cycle, they're voted out. Most American voters actually are, I'm speaking from long historical experience, are actually pretty level-headed about this stuff. People don't like when the schools are disrupted. They don't like when people are fighting culture wars that are actually always a minority position. So again, I'm going to put my faith in the wisdom of local voters, again, provided that the right political structures are in place and that actual, explicit rights are being protected. But there is no explicit right to read, and I'm not even sure exactly what it would look like from a legal perspective. And so I think on the left right now, a lot of people are collapsing that. And they're implying that there is some right for kids to read whatever they want, or that, it's up to experts and teachers to choose the curriculum, which I really don't agree with fundamentally. It's a matter of authority.
Other folks? Okay, I mean, go ahead, Daryl.
Hi, I was wondering if you could maybe speak to everything you've been talking about, but like within the context of Canada as like a settler state and like self-government versus good government, like on Indigenous reserves, is this a failure of self-government or good government? And when we talk about like local knowledge versus ready-made thought, what do you say to those like small, so for instance, I'm from Saskatchewan. What do you do about those small communities where there is something resembling a consensus and those consensuses are problematic? Like we should, sorry, I think I said everything.
Yeah, and this I think is one of my weak points, so I might not have a great answer. On the one hand, I've said, I think throughout the talk, and it's somewhat glib to say maybe, we need to really protect the boundaries of citizenship. Those need to be inclusive in ways that they have not been historically. I think we all recognize that. And so in that sense, I think we need a much more robust protection of civic participation, equal rights, speech rights, et cetera. At the same time, because I am actually in favor of the local and of local participation and pluralism, I think that actually does mean that we need to allow the variety in how people teach and even what they teach within certain boundaries. Again, and I don't know exactly what the boundaries are, but in the past, I've had students say in the American context, well, what about, in the Deep South, if some district decides they don't want to teach evolution? I might be okay with it, actually, provided that, again, it's gone through a real democratic process and the voters there know what they're doing. Not ideal, and I would hope that their local science teacher would have a good long talk with those parents. And so I'm not just shrugging and saying, well, I'll just accept anything, but I do think that we do need to allow the possibility for variation. The idea that school districts are laboratories of democracy, that you need legitimate pluralism, and that can't be imposed from above, which is not always the most popular thing to say. So I know that.
Other questions?
So I really don't want to hog the mic. So if other folks have questions, please interrupt. But I want to push more local, and in part because my own instinct is to embrace it very firmly, as is evident from my talk yesterday. So I'm using this as a chance to sort of explore some of my own predispositions as well. It seems to me that sort of stepping back in your response to my question before, the privileging of the geographic local is based on the notion that the geographic local is the domain of most authentic connection, our richest potential connection. And so I think that that has a lot of face value. It continues even though Dewey's assumptions about the unique value and the potential of face-to-face connectivity seem challenged by contemporary reality. So I want to, let's play into that challenge a little bit. We could evoke Habermas if we want, ideal speech circumstances. So the question is, what if the local is not, the geographic local is not a zone of connection, but rather a site of alienation and a void of connection out of which we must journey to find connection, which I think is many people's experience of the modern world. And the second point is, it seems like your argument about the virtuousness of local moral action depends on the idea that our local moral responsibility is more important because it is where we may have the greatest practical impact. But if we reverse that and we say that then our greatest obligation is to the area in which we may have the greatest practical impact, then that may take us out of the local. So for instance, two examples. If you feel that your local moral struggles are relatively trivial, your greater impact is immaterial in comparison to a small impact on a moral struggle of far greater weight elsewhere. And you are therefore more obliged to that. Or secondarily, what about the circumstances in which your action may actually have a greater impact elsewhere? So let's take an example that I find reprehensible, which is the efforts of conservative religious organizations in this country to fund homophobic, homicidal policy regimes in Africa, where they are not going to be able to impose those policy regimes in this country, but they have a potential to have that impact elsewhere because of resource inequality. So I guess the first question is it possible that the local is not our greatest area of connection? Must we grapple with that? And the second question is, does our obligation to act in the area of our greatest potential impact necessarily take us to the local?
We might be talking about different things, actually, and this actually goes well with the earlier encampment question. Again, if we're offering hypothetically the choice between McGill needs better dining services, which is very local, and presumably we as McGill students could have a real impact there, versus people in Lebanon are being bombed. If we're using a moral judgment, I mean, obviously, I think, yes, you're exactly right. But the two things that I've really tried to stress are, one, when we're thinking about you're offering different avenues of connection, many of those, of course, are not playing out in the public sphere, but in various private spheres. Again, Maya mentioned this with social media and other things, right? There are corporations that are mediating our connections with others. Or in the case of sort of global politics, Africa, the Middle East, wherever, it might be that it's playing out in the public sphere, but not through our, again, local institutions, but through national institutions, say, where, again, it's possible that we could exercise real effect there, but probably not through direct public channels because we're one of very many voters. You, I think, are implying that we should be working through private advocacy organizations, let's say, to end, homophobic legislation in Africa or what have you. All of that might be fine, but it's also not really what I'm talking about as a fundamental function of our citizenship. And so I think also, while of course I myself have been leaning into moral aspects, which I think are actually vital, I'm also just leaning into a certain kind of self-possession and self-government, where it might actually come down to the dining hall or whatever, but it is actually having control over one's own life. And so in that sense, again, I will say that in many or most cases, that is local, almost by definition.
So then just to clarify, you're making a distinction between obligation in the context of civic republicanism on the one hand, and moral obligation more generally, which might be expressed in the civic sphere or through private action.
Yeah, I think so.
Colonialism, indigenous peoples, of course, at the core of this discussion is the residential schools project, which is a huge pedagogical project and colonial project. And I think one of the things we overlook in sort of the discussion of the residential school project, it's a cautionary tale, because intellectual elites were firmly behind this project, right? It was seen as progressive. It was seen as a way of fully integrating indigenous populations into Canadian culture to break down the walls of separation. That's the way it was presented. And that discourse continues up to the 1950s in Canada, even up to the white paper, Trudeau's white paper in 1969. And it was tied in with some darker elements too. I mean, the popularity of social Darwinism in the late 19th and early 20th century amongst the intellectual elites in Canada. McGill, the book by McLaren, McGill was the center for eugenics, the eugenics movement in Canada. We contributed to this discussion. Our famous principal, William Dawson, his son, George Dawson, was a fervent adherent of social Darwinism and produced the major report that served as the basis for the Indian Act. So we often talk about the responsibilities of the churches, but this project was a democratic deliberative project coming out of the federal government, and with the full backing of the academy in many ways. And McGill itself, I think, was a player in this. So, I mean, that's another layer, I think, to add to this discussion.
Other questions, folks?
This working? Okay. So metacognition is not a skill that I have, so I'm going to try to explain my thinking and try to be clear, but there's a good chance it'll be all over the place. Daryl, I loved your question about what do we do when consensus is problematic, and I really liked your answer about how, like, local consensus, if we view them as problematic, it might not necessarily be a bad thing to have that there. And I loved how you explained it. And then I just wanted to take those two ideas a step further, and coming from a lens of a teacher practitioner, what do we do when, because, okay, consensus is a bunch of opinions together, right? So if we take it like a step lower, what do we do when opinions are problematic? So if we're having like discourse in the classroom or discussion, and you're trying to hear all these opinions. So as a teacher, how do you respond to problematic opinions? And what do you do when those opinions kind of begin to form a consensus? And like, how do you address that without taking away their voice or taking away their experience, kind of like what Maya was talking about? How do we theorize with people we don't agree with?
Yeah, I think in my small group yesterday, I probably said something like this. It's always a thorny question. I mean, I've taught too. What do you do when someone says something really bigoted or just something really dumb, and you're like, on the one hand, I think it's really important just to stress sincerity. And I think, I mean, I sound very old fashioned, but the idea of citizenship is something that has a lot of gravity to it. Not every moment in the classroom needs to be like, totally sincere. Kids joke around. But the idea is that if a kid says something, they should mean it, right? They shouldn't be saying it just to get a rise out of people. They shouldn't be saying it to be an asshole. Like they should mean it. And if they mean it, then actually I'm pretty liberal with what people can say in the classroom, provided they're open to actually changing their mind and talking about it. and provided that it's undergirded by a deeper respect of them and from them to all of their classmates and the teacher. But I think it's those affective notions again of equality and respect that actually give one a lot more leeway, I think, with problematic opinions, and hopefully help arrive at some consensus around a better opinion.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hi, this question's for Daniel. As an English teacher, I really appreciated the place of poetry and sort of the political. And I wonder, obviously, we've gone through the Quiet Revolution here in Quebec. With the inclusion of poetry in the gospel, do you see perhaps the English teacher as the new priest, the journal as the new confessional? And is there a risk of the poetic becoming a bit pedantic if we're over moralizing in the classroom?
Well, yeah, my only sort of introduction to this discussion is sort of plowing through Taylor's recent book, Cosmic Connections, which is this 600-page tome on modern poetry. So I'm just beginning to think about this thing, this domain. I don't think Taylor's read on this is just poetry is a form of discourse that allows for the expression of certain kinds of perspectives. I don't think he would be reading this as the formation of a new priesthood, new set of experts. Certainly not, because he sort of celebrates the somewhat tentative nature of poetic discourse and the kind of search and exploratory nature of it. But there, I think you would fully agree with. Do you know Tampio?
Yes.
Yeah.
He sent me the article. Actually, I've read that.
Okay. Yeah. I think I came across it on one of your sites. Poetry. Yeah. I mean, he kind of looks at sort of poetry not sort of as an end in itself, but sort of forming skills. Actually, cultivating the ability of students actually to use poetry as a mode of discourse. So in that sense, it's not taking poems, the poems that are out there as a sacred text that need to be engaged so much as a skill and a form of discourse that can be helpful in articulating some of the things that are within us. I don't know if that speaks at all to what you're.
So I'm going to ask a quick question. I mean, I work on John Dewey, and so I read a book like Freedom and Culture, and I see this kind of lovely Jeffersonian vision, and I'm attracted to it, right? I mean, Arendtian action at the local level, and I mean, there's it's an incredibly compelling idea. I just worry, and I'm sure that many others amongst us do too, that in the context of these new technologies, given the strength of discourses that are acquiring people, I mean, if the local school board is just a battleground for Moms for Liberty and other people who are kind of like working on behalf of these billionaire funded discourses, right? I mean, is there enough of a prospect still for Arendtian action and Dewey's Jeffersonian vision that we should kind of hold out hope for these local forms of governance and collective action? I mean, because it's interesting what happened here in Quebec is the government simply decided to dissolve the school board level entirely. They haven't been able to do it on the English side for sort of strange legal reasons, but effectively Francophone school boards have ceased to exist as entities. People just thought, well, evidently the government thought, well, it's just not worth it anymore. And so everything has been moved up to the level of the provincial bureaucracy where the decisions are all now made. But you can kind of make a technocratic argument for that. You could be like, well, the local sphere of action was just a kind of a waste of time, a festering cesspool of competing discourses funded from above. Why bother?
Right. And you'd be wrong if you made that argument. So this is partly me being very much, I think, a small c conservative. And I did my graduate work at Wisconsin And if you go to any town in Wisconsin, this is not a dead letter, actually. I mean, there are still traditions, there are still, I think, local agency and local energy around all of these issues. That's not true uniformly across the United States. It's not true in many communities in the United States, but it could be. And I guess what really bothers me is that we are too quickly assuming that it's already dead and gone and that there's nothing to preserve, which I flat out reject. And so, yeah, I think we need to really put effort into reminding people or having people be heard when they're making these claims, which strike me not, I said they're given. I mean, it's not automatic that local democracy is just going to flower, but I think that there are almost innate, again, just a process of being related to each other. People want a voice. And we do still have in most US states, and I would also argue in many Canadian contexts, we still do have political mechanisms and institutions through which to express that voice.
All right, folks, I think we've kind of come to our very brief coffee break time. So let's have a round of applause for our excellent speakers.